I mean, it's shocking the extent of it, but at the same time, it's not a surprise to us at all. When you see, from a public policy perspective, decisions that are being made, you see social assistance rates have not kept pace with even inflation, let alone the cost of living. We see things like minimum wage, again, that's just not kept pace with the true cost of living. We see unaffordable housing in every part of Ontario, but particularly in Toronto. We see a lack of affordable rental options. We see lack of social housing options. We see lack of investments in maintaining the existing stock. So once we see all of these trends over time, it's not that big of a surprise that we continue to see food bank use escalate. But I think what is a surprise is around the food inflation piece and just how big of an impact that has had in terms of what we're seeing at food banks.
Quick follow-up with you. Who is coming to the food bank now?
So I think, generally speaking, we see a slice of the whole city coming to the food bank, but in particular, before we would see a lot of individuals with fixed incomes, so people relying on social assistance primarily. But now we're seeing the fastest growing group is actually those who are employed, and that is because of the cost of living. When we do the quick math of if someone's earning $15.50 minimum wage, let's say they're lucky and they have a 40-hour work week, which is actually quite rare for food bank clients. Even with that, you're looking at around $2,700 a month in earnings before tax. When we look at a studio apartment that's available, that's listed today, I believe it's around $1,900. So already you're seeing that just doesn't add up. So throw in food inflation in there as well, and you've got people really struggling to make ends meet.
Sarah, why are we here?
I think we're here today to talk about this crisis and try to figure out why more people aren't talking about it and doing more about it. I'm sure Val will be able to share. New data came out last week, and I think 18.4% of people across the country are now struggling with food insecurity. 1 in 4 children is living in a food insecure home. That is not okay. We need to be doing more. We need to be advocating for change and addressing many of the issues that Talia just touched on.
And this is a situation, I mean, food banks, as we've heard, have been around for 4 decades right now. And yet, the crisis, I'm hearing rhetoric used right now, I haven't heard in 40 years. How has it reached this point?
I mean, it's obviously for a multitude of factors, all outlined here today. I mean, I think for us on the grocery side, for as long as there's been food banks, grocery stores have been supporting them. But even we feel in the conversations we have with partners like Daily Bread, that sort of intense need on the other end of the phone. So it's certainly a challenge.
Talia, I'm going to put something to you that I heard the other day from somebody who is not a dumb guy, and I'm not going to identify him. He's not a dumb guy, but he put the following forward. He said, I'm sure this is not all food insecurity, people who show up to food banks. I'm sure it's some people, and he didn't say the majority, but he said, I'm sure it's some people who just want free food. Your comment.
We hear that certainly from people. I think the important thing to remember is that food is a human right, and everyone should have access to food. So our food banks are low barrier. We don't ask for documentation to be able to access those programs. But when you are on the ground, when you talk to food bank clients, you know that no one is going there because they just want to be there. People are going there, and Valerie has research that supports this. Food banks are the place of last resort. People go after they have already borrowed from friends and family, after they've already considered selling belongings, taking on debt. Nobody wants to be relying on a charity. It's not an experience most people want. And so I think that we have to remember that in an ideal world, people want the agency. They want to have the independence to be able to choose the food they want. They want to be able to go to the grocery store and afford the food that their family wants and needs.
Valerie, is there a stigma still attached to being seen going to ask for food at a food bank?
Oh, of course. There always will be. In an affluent society like ours, the idea that you go to a public charity and declare your inability to afford food for yourself and your children, of course, that will never be anything other than a deeply humiliating activity. And it doesn't matter how welcoming, how low barrier these agencies are. Nobody will ever go there if they don't have to. And that person that said that to you, Steve, you just give him my number, and I'll have a good talking to after this program.
Could see your blood boiling as I was even getting the question out of my mouth. But that attitude is out there.
Well, but they're dreaming. I mean, the 6.9 million Canadians that are living in food insecure situations right now, that's not a number of people using food banks. That's a very rigorous measurement of a very significant problem of food access that is done by Statistics Canada. And it's way bigger than any food bank number.
And I will add just to that we survey food bank clients annually, and we know that most clients who are coming to food banks are severely food insecure. That means that they are missing full meals. They're missing entire days of food.
Where they have nothing to eat.
Where they have nothing to eat. And so the fact that people would think these people aren't deserving of food is really problematic.
Not that they're not deserving of food, but that maybe...
They might be taking advantage of it. But when you are going a full day without a meal, or even having to miss a meal, or even having to pull back on the amount of food you're eating, how nutritious the food is, I think we have a real problem.
Okay, Valerie, let me put this to you. 10 years ago, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food told Canadians that, quote, reliance on food banks served as a moral release valve for the state. What does that mean?
Well, I think there's a mythology in Canada, and it's one that's been particularly drawn upon by at least our federal government, and to a lesser extent provincially, that we don't have to worry about people going hungry. There are charities, there's ample food, and they'll be okay. I mean, it's the image of that this man portrayed for you, right? That people are just doing that because it's available to them. And if you think about the media coverage of food drives, which we see constantly in Canada, what we're seeing is abundance. And when we report on donations to food banks or corporate investments in food banks, again, we hear these huge numbers of thousands of tons, thousands of pounds, millions of pounds, whatever. We get a sense that there's an abundance of food. Nobody ever does the rest of the arithmetic. So I think this illusion that somehow the worst of the problem is being mitigated by these charity activities is something that has enabled provincial and federal governments to carry on with policies that are, hard-hearted and that are at the root of this issue.
And yet I always see a premier or prime minister doing a photo op at a food bank numerous times during the year.
Absolutely.
What do you think when you see that?
Oh, it makes my blood boil too. I mean,
your blood's doing a lot of boiling today. Okay, gotta watch. Okay, why are you involved in this?
Well, the Maple Leaf Centre for Food Security was launched about 7 years ago, and we wanted to think about what we could be doing to make a difference in Canada, how we could create real social impact. And the issue of food insecurity was something that really came up as it needed to be addressed. So we launched with a big, bold goal of trying to work collaboratively across sectors to see food insecurity reduced by 50% by 2030. In the time that we've existed, food insecurity has only gotten worse. I think as Talia and Val have both said, food bank use is really a Band-Aid to the problem. It is helping people that need help today, but everyone agrees that more action is needed. I think for far too long, we've relied on under-resourced charities to solve a big issue. And really, we all need to come together and think about what needs to change and how are we going to drive action to ensure that we can see progress against this goal of reducing food insecurity in Canada.
Alain, how about you? Why is your company involved in this?
Yeah, I think we're primarily involved because we have access to so much food. That's where the need is, and we're positioned in communities all across the province, and are sort of well placed to give food to these food banks that need all the support, not to solve the issue, but to sort of address the sort of real-time needs that people are facing. So that's historically been our sort of direct role from a food bank perspective. But similar to the center, thinking about what everyone here is thinking about, which is how do we solve it versus treat it.
Talia, how much of what you collect and then distribute to people who need it comes from folks like this, as opposed to individuals who leave a can in a box as they leave the supermarket?
Yeah, so we receive both monetary donations as well as food donations from the public as well as from the private sector. So when it comes to our food donations, primarily that is coming from the food industry, whether that's grocery retailers, whether that's direct from farms. About 30% of our food is actually coming directly from farms. And on a monetary scale, the majority is actually coming from individuals. And that money helps us keep the lights on, of course, a small amount, but primarily we're actually investing in our programs. We actually have to purchase a significant amount of food because even through partnerships with food industry and donations, we don't get a balanced set of food that we can distribute. We want to make sure people have access to, a balanced diet, and that involves dairy, meat, and protein alternatives, vegetables, fruit. So about 67% of the food we distribute is actually fresh. So that's one of the kind of misconceptions, is that people just get kind of cans of food at food banks, which maybe has been true historically, but not anymore.
Okay, to that end, and forgive my ignorance here, but do you have relationships with hotels around town whereby when they have big events, you get access to the leftovers?
So that would be more food reclamation, which is not really in our model, but Second Harvest is kind of the leader in that industry. So many of the programs we support also get support from Second Harvest, but that's a very different kind of model that they're operating.
Gotcha. And Lam, back to you. Loblaws. They're not called Loblaws anymore, are they? I just showed my age.
Just drop the S.
It's just
You're
Loblaw
close.
now, I know. It's just Loblaw. 2,200 stores nationwide. How much food are you folks donating to food banks?
Yeah, well, we donate millions of kilograms of food a year, and that number is going higher, actually, just specifically for the reason just cited. You know, historically, you'd go to the store, we'd raise either money at the cash, or you would donate, you drop it into the bin at the front. But increasingly, we're connecting the back of our store into those food reclamation projects. So through Second Harvest, through food banks across the country, connecting food that can still be used and for, to meet a need out in the community. And we just actually, just a few months ago, connected every single one of our stores with a food charity across the country. So, trying to meet that rising need.
And just, for my own edification here, the stuff that you donate, is it all sort of top drawer stuff, or are we talking about like maybe that apple with a bruise on it that a client's not going to buy, so that goes to the food bank?
Yeah, I think it's all sorts of things come out of the store, depending on whichever stream we just said. So from the best of the best to the stuff that is still good to use, but maybe wouldn't fly off the shelf instantly.
Okay. How about Maple Leaf Foods? What do you do in terms of donations to food banks?
Yeah, on an annual basis, we're donating about $3.5 million directly from our distribution centers. And we've organized that with 4 key charities that have wide distribution nets that know that every other week they are receiving $10,000 to $12,000 of product that they'll be able to distribute through their networks.
Okay. With that on the record, I'd like your view on how you regard corporation donations to food banks.
I think that we need to talk a bit more about who's food insecure. And you mentioned it in your intro that food banks are seeing more people who are from the workforce, and certainly Talia said that as well. We know that in terms of the Statistics Canada surveys on household food insecurity, that over half of households that are food insecure in Canada, and that would be also true in Ontario, are relying on employment incomes. So those are people in the workforce, but still unable to make ends meet. What is then the role of corporations as it relates to the problem of food insecurity? Well, all these people that are food insecure are working for somebody. And that means they're working, but they're in conditions that still do not enable them to cover the costs of basic needs. The role of corporations, I would suggest, is not to donate their leftovers through a charity stream, and not to be applauded for doing that, but to be challenged around the conditions that they're providing for their employees, and to be applauded when they can tell us that they've got a workforce that is not part of these god-awful statistics.
Ellen, could you react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we agree that it's important that we simultaneously doing all this support for food banks and food charities, that we play a role in tackling this issue from other ends. So we talk about wages. So Loblaw employs 100,000 people in this province. The average wage, full-time, part-time, is $19 for those folks that work in those stores. Some people make more, some people make less. And so we're constantly sort of managing how you run a grocery store and pay 100,000 people, an amount that sort of meets their needs, while simultaneously keeping the price of food down. In another room, a lot of people are concerned, 9.7% inflation, price of food going up. What are we doing to do more to bring it down? So I think we're live to these concerns and are trying to balance from our seat how you make a positive difference on all those fronts.
I mean, I'm inferring from Valerie's comments, Sarah, that she's looking at what you two are doing, and while she applauds any corporate, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but while she's grateful to see, or happy to see, corporations contributing, she may also be saying, some of the people who work in your stores are actually people who are needing to avail themselves of food banks because they're not making very much money. Fair comment?
I think that we know that a lot of people who are food insecure, as she stated, the majority of people who are food insecure do rely on wages for their primary source of income. We also know that food will not solve food insecurity. and we need to do more to support people on income solutions. So be that through increased social policies or increased wages, both need to be explored. I think at Maple Leaf, we've been quite clear in saying we know food will not solve this answer, and we're looking at how we can use our voice and how we can help raise awareness about the issues and really go directly to government to advocate for change as well.
Do you see it as more their responsibility or somebody else's responsibility? I don't know. Who do you put on your list of people responsible for solving this issue, and in what order?
I would put government on this list. I mean, I think the policies that need to change to insulate Canadians from food insecurity sit in the shop of the federal and provincial government. So I think that is very, very clear. What Sarah keeps talking about is advocacy, and the question is, what does it take to get the attention and the intelligent, evidence-based policy directions out of the federal and provincial government? And that's a huge question.
And can I jump in on that?
Please.
Just in terms of where we sit at Daily Bread Food Bank, so part of our mission is around advocacy. That is, a core component of what we do. And I think every time we have those interactions, whether it's with the private sector, whether it's for the government photo op, we take it as our responsibility to do that education work so that there is no person who is interacting with Daily Bread, whether they're coming on site to our warehouse to volunteer, whether they're donating, who walks away. Our goal is to make sure every person walks away understanding what are the root causes of food insecurity. And what are the solutions? And I think having that partnership with the private sector and having those conversations with government is so critical, because we need the private sector, of course, to be the most socially responsible that they can be. But we also know that it's the government's role to set the minimum standards. And until there are minimum standards that are livable wages and adequate incomes, there's going to be a lot of variability in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector, for that matter. There's just going to be a lot of variability. And so that's why, from our perspective, we welcome those interactions, because they're an opportunity for that education, collaboration, and potentially even joint advocacy.
I want to be careful how I ask this next question, because we're always grateful when people from corporate Ontario accept our invitation to come have a seat at the table here and share their views with us. But I know people watching this and listening to this are wanting me to ask you two right now, why don't you pay your people more and maybe up for multi-billion-dollar companies, why don't you give more to, she probably wants me to say this too, why don't you give more money to the food banks as well to do their thing? Is that possible?
Is it possible to give more money?
It's possible to give more money, pay your people more. If we're talking about the precarity of life in Ontario, It gets less precarious the more you pay people.
So I'd say at Maple Leaf, we really work hard to provide competitive and decent wages and provide really good benefits for the people who work at our sites. The vast majority of our sites do have employees that are part of a union that also advocate for them. So I think we've done a good job on working on taking care of our people and making sure that they can access the things that they need to live a healthy life. As far as giving more money, I think there's always a possibility. I think we work really hard to make investments in organizations that are driving change, looking to see what works and what makes a difference. So we've invested in things like research, both with the Daily Bread Food Bank and the Ottawa Food Bank, to think, how can we help people in the best way possible who are accessing their services? Research has demonstrated that if you are accessing food, you probably need access to other services. So if you can integrate those into that model, help people access the other benefits they might need, that can help drive change. So we're trying to do let's invest in what's going on right now to help people, at the same time as advocating for change and taking care of the people that work for us.
If I heard right, I heard her say she's open to the possibility of giving you more money. So I would hit her up before she leaves the studio. Just a word to the wise here. Alain, let me try this with you. You know that there are people who work for Loblaw, singular, who need to use the food bank in order to make it through the day. How does that sit with Loblaw?
So, look, first of all, no one should have to go to the food bank. Just full stop. I think for us, when we think about wages, is what I said. I think we think we do pay very fair retail wages, and it's really challenging to pull off that balance of how you keep the price of food down, pay people as much as you can, and stay a profitable company that employs 100,000 people. It's something we're at every day. I think we're doing a pretty good job of it. And I think it's something it's hard for one company to do on its own, especially when it's grocery retail, when you're talking about those 2% margins that are so well known. So I think that's where government actually has a role to play in a progressive minimum wage and ensuring that pressure is being put on for the lower end of the pay spectrum upwards.
Talia, I think we invited a bunch of politicians to show up and join us for our discussion here today, and alas, we were unsuccessful in convincing anybody who was in a position of authority on these issues to do so. However, were they here, I think members of the Ontario government would point out that they increased the disability support plan by 5%, largest increase in decades. They would say they boosted earning exemptions by 400%. They have tied ODSP payments to inflation. They've extended health benefits to people on Ontario Works, which is essentially welfare. Anyway, the list goes on. How do you react to that?
I think those are certainly important steps forward, but I think we have to remember that it's not one point in time policy changes. We need to see sustained investments over time. And for example, ODSP, it had fallen behind. It had lost pace with inflation. And so even a 5% increase isn't even going to bring people to a place where they can live on today's standards. They're already so far behind. These are individuals who are, $900 below the poverty line. That's with the increase. And so, these are people who cannot work. On Ontario Disability Support Program, most people cannot sustain a full-time job. And these are people who we've legislated to live in poverty. And so I think that, I'm not that surprised that we're not seeing government spokespeople around this table, because I think that, they have, these kinds of investments, small incremental changes, when what we really need is transformational change. We need a bright, visionary thinker and mobilizer to take us to the next level in Canada and say, we need a social safety net that works for everybody, that leaves no one behind. And I don't think we're there yet.
Does that mean a guaranteed annual income, for example?
I think it should be explored in great detail. I think that, there's lots of different ways to get to what that looks like, whether it's a universal basic income, whether it's basic incomes, where there's different, we have for children, we have for seniors, we need to close some of those gaps. There's different ways to get there, but I think ultimately, yes, what we need is a minimum threshold that nobody in Canada should fall below that income threshold. That's going to be the primary solution to what we're seeing at food banks.
We did have that under the previous government of Ontario. There were 3 pilot programs in 3 cities around Ontario. One of the first things the current government did when it came in 2018 was to cancel that. Yeah. Was that what was your view of that move?
We were really disappointed with that move, because I think having the data is really important for making good public policy decisions. Now, in the absence of that data, I don't think that should hold us back from exploring this further. We can do lots of different modeling to understand the impact of basic income. But I think also it broke the trust of people who were enrolled in that program. They took a leap of faith by participating in that program. They thought that they would have this guaranteed amount for a certain number of months and years, and that was withdrawn from them. And investments they had made in their own life in terms of education or a better apartment or whatever it was to make them have a better outcome in their life, that went up in smoke. And so I think losing that trust was really hard for the community as well.
Let me get your views on, every now and then governments see a particular issue or a particular demographic and they say, I got an idea. We're going to have a minister responsible for disabled issues or equity or children or whatever, women's issues, so-called as they were back in the day. What about a minister of food banks? Do we need that?
Oh, no. I think that would be really bad.
You think that'd be a bad
I think you'd
idea?
have a minister responsible for food insecurity that can bring together many ministries and think about what do we need to be doing together to address the issue. But the idea that you'd have a government responsible for food charity, that would make my blood boil, like Val was saying. We know that food will not solve the problem. We need other solutions. So having someone in charge of bringing people together to talk about how we get to those solutions, to ensure that when policies are implemented, we're not only looking at poverty reduction, but also looking at the impact that it has on reducing food insecurity, that to me would make more sense.
You were a hard no right out of the gate on this.
I think we've already got the ministers we need. We've got Minister of Finance, and at the end of the day, this is an income problem, and the solutions reside with reforming standards as they relate to income supports in this province, plus employment standards. The other minister we've got that nobody's talked about yet is the Minister of Health. And as we languish in this appalling situation with 1/4 of children living in food insecure households, 18 point whatever percent of Ontario households, as we languish in this, what we've got is people burning up healthcare dollars because nobody is able to maintain their health in this context of food insecurity. So there is a cost that this province is paying on a daily basis, and that is through its healthcare spending as it relates to the very modifiable health risk of household food insecurity.
It's kind of crazy to pay a lot of money to treat people who are sick rather than just spend it up front.
That's right. And still to fail, because we also know that mortality rates are higher amongst people who are food insecure. So yeah, we pay more and we still don't even get the end results in terms of health. So that's the other part of the conversation that I think we need to be weaving into the policy discussion.
Talia, let me just, for argument's sake, let me push back a little bit on this. I'll make the argument. A minister responsible for food banks, if you wanted to call him or her that, could have some convening power to bring a lot of these different ministers together to share some ideas and get stuff happening. Could be a specific voice at the cabinet table for food banks in a way that you perhaps don't have right now. Is there any value in that position in your view?
I don't think it makes sense to have a minister responsible for food banks specifically. I think that we know what the solutions are. There's very good research, thank you to Val specifically for that. So we know what the solutions are, and what we're lacking is the political will to make those investments. And they are upstream investments, and that's the hard part. We know, I come from the public health world, and this is always the challenge, that investing upstream takes that leap of faith that those investments are going to be enjoyed for generations to come. But that doesn't fit into a political cycle, an election cycle, right? So you have to make that. You have to be willing to make that investment up front and know that the benefits aren't going to be reaped in your election cycle. So I think ultimately, I don't think we necessarily need a minister. I think what we need is for all elected representatives to really care about the issue. And we do our best to try to make them care. And I do think that they do care. But I think the problem is politicians see trade-offs. They see, we invest this amount in this program, it's going to increase our deficit by this amount. There's all sorts of different ways that they want to spend that money. And I think, again, we need that political will to say this is an investment in our future. It's an investment in preventing those downstream healthcare costs. Also, we see increased justice costs. We see opportunity costs as a result of poverty and food insecurity. Our colleagues at Feed Ontario did a report, and they estimated poverty is costing Ontario $33 billion a year in health, justice, and missed opportunities. So we need that investment. I don't think it necessarily has to come from one minister, but I think that we need that strong advocate in government.
Alain, didn't hear from you yet on this. A minister for food banks?
I think we have enough ministers. I think someone else can take it up.
You're for fewer politicians.
Maybe.
Okay. Valerie, here's a bit of an odd question. If Canada's acceptance of food banks is as widespread after 40 years as it appears to be, how do we start to make the notion of food banks unacceptable among the general population?
I think we may never be able to do that, but I think what we really need to do is make the notion of food insecurity unacceptable. Because one of the problems, and frankly, it's a problem with the way that media covers this issue, is that it's constantly viewed through the lens of food banks and food bank numbers going up, food bank numbers going down, corporations donating to food banks or not. And I think that's part of the problem, not part of the solution. So I would say that the focus needs to be on how do we get not just the public, but more importantly, elected officials to take leadership on what is a very serious social issue as well as public health problem.
Well, you've tried a lot for the last 40 years and nothing seems to have worked yet. So what's next?
I think we have hit a crisis point, right? As we've seen, this continued proliferation of food charity in Canada, food insecurity numbers are off the charts. We've got a bigger problem with food insecurity than we've ever had before. We've got more and more data showing its impacts on health and healthcare systems, healthcare spending. So, I feel like we're getting to a point, like the fact that you're convening this conversation is one of the indicators for me that we're getting to a tipping point, perhaps, on this issue where everybody is agreed that the status quo is unsustainable.
And we've run out of time, so you get the last word on this. I want to thank the four of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. Sarah Stern from Maple Leaf Center for Food Security, Alain Brandon from the Loblaw Companies Limited, Talia Bronstein from the Daily Bread Food Bank, Valerie Tarasuk, University of Toronto, Department of Nutritional Sciences, lead investigator for Proof as well. We're really grateful that you could all come in and help shine some light on this issue. Thanks.
Thank you.
Few events rival the crowning of a new British monarch, observed across the Commonwealth, but especially in London, where the ceremonies take place, the pomp, the ritual, and of course, the crowds lay claim to the significance of the moment. Novelist Jennifer Robson's new book of historical fiction, Coronation Year, is set against the backdrop of Queen Elizabeth's accession to the throne in 1953. It also gives her a fascinating perspective on the coronation of King Charles. And Jennifer Robson joins us now. Welcome back.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoy the book.
Thank you.
I have a slight confession.
Okay.
I got stressed at one point and I had to look to the back to see if everything worked out the way I wanted it to.
Yeah.
But we are going to talk about the book in a few moments, but big weekend. King Charles was crowned the king. What were your thoughts on what happened this past weekend?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. I'm still feeling a little shaky after getting up so early. I mean, I think I was up at 3 a.m. to watch with the same group of friends. We watched these royal occasions together. And, I was struck yet again by the historic nature of it. How could I not be a history nerd to my core?
You're a social historian.
Yes, and watching something, the key elements that we saw on Saturday were elements that the precise wording may have changed, but the order in which they occur within the coronation, these central elements of, the recognition, the oath, the anointing, and so on, they're more or less unchanged for 1,050 years. If we look at the first acknowledged coronation of an English king being that of King Edgar in the late 900s, I mean, that kind of blows my mind. That something that's so ancient that practically nothing of that world remains today, apart from, the genetic descendants of the people who are alive, for presumably many are still alive on this globe. But the idea that something so ancient has endured is really fascinating to me. And it's not an unexamined interest, or in the sense that, I have concerns, as I think anybody who sits down and thinks about it for more than a few minutes, about the idea of one family of white people who have inherited this role, they get to maintain this position without, anything. They're not elected into the role, and does that reflect the true nature of Britain, its diversity today, and in fact of Canada? Those are things I really think about a lot and wonder, am I just accepting this in an unquestioning way? And what is the role of sentiment in my reaction to all of this? And I certainly did feel very sentimental and somewhat emotional at moments, when the crown was placed on the king's head.
You're bringing up a lot of points I want to follow up, but why were you emotional?
I think for me, and this happened certainly when the Queen passed away as well, a lot of my feelings, the more I examined them, I thought were probably caught up in feelings associated with childhood, the loss of childhood, the loss of people dear to me. In my mind, I have my late grandmother, my late mother, and somehow the Queen was not really a stand-in. I never saw her in person even, but she was this maternal figure, as it were, who I felt as if I knew. I didn't really know her. None of us knew her, but she was there. She was a very reassuring presence, and that brings up all sorts of feelings that may be true emotions. It may be sentimentality. That's something I spend a lot of time kind of trying to parse what is real and what is a manufactured emotion. But I did feel, as I was watching the ceremony at the crack of dawn on Saturday, I did feel my heartstrings being plucked, and moments where the Prince of Wales knelt before his father and swore his fealty to him, which is, fealty, if that isn't an ancient term, I'm not sure what is. Those really resonated with me.
I think the BBC reported that the coronation cost anywhere between $50 to $100 million. They haven't released the exact figure, but there's a cost of living crisis. People are they're struggling having food. There were protests during the coronation, and people were arrested, and some people were saying, why, this is my free speech, why can't I protest? So how do you balance those? How do you balance those two things in celebrating the coronation of the king against the backdrop of the reality that a lot of people in the UK are living through right now?
I think it's a really, really difficult path to tread. And I think it's one, in all fairness, and I feel a lot of people have a knee-jerk reaction to the king, that they just are bound and determined to dislike him, and are not really willing to kind of set the past aside to any degree and let him do his best. So again, that's sentiment kind of leading me to a certain degree. I think the king is certainly very mindful of this. Not to be an apologist for him, but I think he was running the show effectively, and there was an effort to trim the costs and things that might seem insignificant, like trimming the length of the route, were done really only because that was a significant way to bring down costs, because there are fewer security personnel needed to watch the route. But at the same time, it's a very real and pressing concern that people are having a really hard time of things in Britain, and I would argue in other countries in the Commonwealth as well. And to spend so much money on what is, what you could fairly say is a relic of the past, is always going to be a contentious issue. And I found myself torn as I was watching between being absolutely humbled and awestruck by the beauty of the surroundings, the music, the ceremony itself, and I was also struck by, I think there was a sincere effort. Did it go far enough? I'm not sure, but I think there was a sincere effort to include people from all backgrounds, ethnicities, faiths in the service. If you compare it to 1953, and I've watched the film of the Queen's coronation so many times, I feel it's burned into my brain. That coronation was a profoundly white gathering. There are only a handful of people who were not white. They would have been monarchs from other countries, such as the Queen of Tonga, who was so famously popular because she kept the top of her carriage down even though it was raining, so that she could wave to the crowds and they could wave to her. She was hugely popular in London that day and afterwards. But she's one. There's maybe a half a dozen people there, which is just. You look at it now, and I think what strikes me looking at the audience in the 1953 coronation is there's something wrong, there's something missing. And that's because Britain was a diverse nation then, it just wasn't acknowledged.
Well, you drew a great picture of the coronation in the book, which we're going to get to in a few moments. But you mentioned Prince William. The other son, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, was there.
Yeah.
He was wearing something called a morning suit. He was sitting in the third row. And one commentator on Twitter was saying, his face was obscured by Princess Anne's feather.
Yes.
He didn't do any interviews, and he didn't participate in any of the coronation activities. What did you think of his role or lack of it?
I thought it was, it must have been heartbreaking for everyone involved. As much as it's easy to kind of, none of us really know what is going on in the heart of the family. And I did think it was rather shabby that Prince Andrew, who really is beneath contempt, was wearing his garter robes, and Prince Harry, who is entitled to wear not garter robes, it's the Royal Victorian Order, I think. His
Very
robes.
ornate.
Yeah, he, either they, I feel as if Prince Harry really, again, should have been accorded some degree of respect in that sense. When I think of it, I keep going back to the thoughts of my sister, who's a psychotherapist, and she's the person I turn to whenever I want to understand how people tick. She's very helpful when I'm writing my books and trying to figure out what motivates people. And her take on this, which she related to me, was that, again, this is a family. If you take away the role they occupy, if you take away the billions of dollars worth of jewels and the magnificent surroundings, they're people like anyone else. And I feel a real sense of sympathy to everyone involved. I mean, I think, gosh, I've had disagreements with my kids, and nothing quite on the order of what's separating the King and Prince Harry, but if all of those were to become public fodder, if people were to know and comment upon that, I think that would not only be mortifying, but it would also make it extraordinarily difficult to have any kind of reconciliation. So that, to me, was a real moment of sadness in watching the coronation. And I'm not sure, however, how it could have, what they could have done otherwise that would have satisfied everyone. It's just they're in a bit of a pickle right now.
I have so many questions about the coronation. I'm going to ask you one more, and because I really want to have time for us to talk about the book. A lot of this hedges on the popularity, right? This past weekend, the Prime Minister confirmed that the King will be on the $20 bills and some coins. There was a poll that said that only an average of just 38% of those polled would want to see the King on our money, and that was an Angus Reid poll. Over in the UK, we know that the monarchy has always been more popular amongst older generations than younger ones, but there was a poll by YouGov, a polling firm in the United Kingdom. It showed 75% of respondents between the ages of 18 and 24 said they cared very little or not at all about the coronation. And another YouGov poll found that 78% of young people weren't interested in the royal family whatsoever. What do you see as the future of the monarch family?
See that,
the British monarchy.
Again, that is one, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. The question is, setting aside issues of how popular they are or not, is the difficulty is if there is no royal family and, say, a republic is enacted in both the UK and Canada, then who then becomes the head of state? And how do we reorder our government so that it is as stable as possible? I think you see in other countries where the head of state is not only elected but is kind of in the thick of things politically. That can lead to real instability. I think looking at the United States at the moment, that there's an example. And as much as they may not be popular, they do occupy a role that is quite stabilizing for our system of government and for the UK system of government. And it's not that I personally would be opposed necessarily to having a system of government that doesn't include a non-elected, inherited, head of state that has inherited the position not through any of their personal actions. It's just devolved to them. But then my concern is, what do we have instead, and what do we have that preserves the stability that I think a lot we may not think about day to day, but it does afford us. A sense of, again, stability, of continuity that we enjoy without necessarily reflecting on on how important it is to us as a country.
Well, let's talk about the book. We have a few more minutes left. Wonderful cover, very
Love the cover.
just draws you in. One of my favorite characters, probably my favorite character, has the same name as my grandfather, Alexander James.
I think that's amazing.
Which is really cool. Can you give us a synopsis of what the book is about?
So the book, the main setting, which is almost a character unto itself, is the Blue Lion Hotel, which dates to the 1560 and has kind of weathered the centuries as a hotel, has somehow managed to stay open. And it's now run in 1953 by a young woman called Edie Howard, who is the last of her family, the last of the Howards. And she's barely managing to keep the place open. And then by, just the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, the coronation procession is announced, and it goes straight past her hotel, which will allow her to, charge a premium. So that
life-changing.
Life-changing moment for her. And so we're following Edie as she prepares for this big moment for the Blue Lion. And two other characters are central to the book. The first is a young woman called Stella Donati, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, Italian, as you might guess from her name. And she's come to England to start anew. And she's working as a staff photographer for a weekly news magazine called Picture Weekly, which would be not unlike Life magazine in the United States or Picture Post in the UK. And then the third character is Alexander James Geddes, who is an artist who's been commissioned to paint a portrait of the Queen on Coronation Day as she rides past in her Gold State coach. And so he's come to the hotel. It's a handy place for him to stay while he's preparing for the big day, doing his preparatory drawings. And so the three of them are drawn together and become friends. And then, overlaying all of this, there are some malevolent actions by a mysterious actor who is determined to destroy, Coronation Day and possibly the hotel and the people who live in it as well.
I loved the relationships between the characters and how the way that you wrote them, there was little surprises here and there. But I also loved how much history was in this book. A few details in the book surprised me, like the fact that at the time of Queen Elizabeth's coronation, there was still rations of ingredients like butter. Why was that the case?
So Britain, if you imagine in 1945, at the end of World War II, the treasury was almost, you could say, literally empty. There was just nothing left. Britain as a nation had been beggared by the war. In order to kind of rebuild the economy, what had been wartime privations, such as rationing and then austerity measures, continued after the war. They continued through 1947 when the Queen Princess Elizabeth was married, and that's the backdrop to one of my previous books, The Gown. And even into 1953, a lot of the rationing had been lifted, but things like butter and sugar were still under the ration, sweets as well. Now, the rationing was lifted later in the year, but in the period that encompasses the book, the first 6 months of 1953. I mean, so you think of it, people who are trying to bake cakes for Coronation Day had to, they had to perform wonders. A lot of the time it would be a kind of, sharing with neighbors in the spirit that got people through the war, but it had to endure after the war as well.
There's a lot of community in the book. You also mentioned that the female guests to the coronation were not allowed to wear hats, but could or should wear veils pinned to the backs of their heads.
Just ridiculous.
What was that about?
It was called a light veiling. It was interesting as I think they actually, with this coronation, they managed to get the dress code just right in terms of people being comfortable and not having to wear ridiculous things. But for the 1953 coronation, women were supposed to wear gowns that went to the ground, even though it happened in the late morning. And the idea was, well, if one had a tiara, one would wear the tiara. But if not, which would be most people, you could have this light veiling pinned to the back of your head with maybe a few feathers or something. Maybe a predecessor of the modern fascinators that women often wear.
Well, something that you mentioned in the book, it was just like a small paragraph, but it stood out for me because you wrote about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 and the desire for people to be there in person, even though it was being televised, it was broadcasted on television. And the same applied this past weekend. The weather was terrible. I know I lived in the UK for 5 years.
Yeah.
And the weather, you have like a week of summer.
Yeah.
But a lot of people came out.
I would have been surprised if it hadn't been terrible, right?
Right.
I just, that's my overall memories of living in England,
Yeah.
just as you did, is just rain, a lot of rain.
So why do you think that people want to be there in person instead of just watching it on television?
I think it's for that feeling of being able to say to your grandchildren, I was there. I got to watch, in this case, the King and Queen go by in the gold state coach. The coach, which I've made no bones about it, I think is absolutely hideous and is notoriously uncomfortable. I mean, I feel the King and Queen probably had to have a Dramamine or something before they got in. But it's that feeling of participating, of being a part of things, and it was again very moving to see how many people stayed out in the rain and wanted to have that moment, and that in itself is a form of community building, I think.
You have a PhD in British economic and social history from Oxford. Why did you start writing novels instead of going into academia?
To be the blunt answer is that I couldn't get a job. History departments around the world have been steadily diminishing, getting smaller and smaller for years. History is just a less popular major for students at university, which I think is unfortunate, but that's, there's nothing I can do to fix that, except possibly write books that make people interested in history. Before I started writing, this year will mark the 10th year since my first book came out, I was working as an editor, and I was a freelancer at home with my kids, and I felt that my wheels are spinning a little bit, and I really wanted my children to look to me as someone that they felt proud of, and not in because I was famous or anything, which I'm not, but I wanted them to be proud of me because they saw in me someone who was doing work that she loved. That was especially important for my daughter. I really needed her to see that work is important to women, that work that you find meaningful is very important. And that's why I started to try to write my first book. And I'm as surprised as anyone else that I'm sitting here, and very grateful.
You did a terrific job. It's an excellent book, and I learned so much history that I didn't know by reading this book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
We thank you so much for coming in to speak to us about this and the coronation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, May 8th, 2023. Tomorrow is Back to Basics, the best blueprint for Ontario education as the province proposes. We'll explore that and whether a lottery is the best way to allocate spaces for special programs in the Toronto District School Board. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.